Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I'm all right. About yourself?
Doing well, doing well. Thanks for
Thank
taking the
you.
time to speak with me today. I appreciate it.
No problem. Mm.
I hope you've had a good week thus far. It is Friday, so hope you're having.
Well, I'm glad it's over.
Yeah, yeah, I
Got
hear.
a light behind me. What the hell is that? Hmm. What is that?
Sure. It looks cool though. I like your backdrop.
Oh, thank you very much. My daughter made large parts of that logo, so
Oh, okay. Well, she did a neat job. I was looking at it a few days ago and thought it was really cool.
hmm. Thank you very much.
Um, yeah, thanks again for coming on. And I found you through John Vervaeke's podcast you did with him recently, and
Yes, thank you.
it was such an intriguing discussion because it kind of merged the thoughts that Vervaeke talks about a lot with this conceptual idea of the wild systems model. And
Hmm.
my endeavor with my YouTube channel has just been to try to investigate consciousness a little bit further and the subject
Sure.
nature of reality and try
Mm.
to come to a conclusion on what that really is. And
Mm.
it's been a journey from kind of assuming that it was a physical emergent phenomena to maybe a panpsychism to at this point, I'm kind of open to anything, but it's seeming to me that panpsychism has kind of emerged as something that could describe consciousness pretty well. But I found that wild systems theory and what you put forth kind of also synergizes with that a little bit.
Oh, thank you.
And wanted to ask you if you could kind of explain to me what wild systems theory is and how you see it relating to consciousness.
Well, one of the reasons I've been doing work on wild systems is because of consciousness and volition, right? How do we do what we do, and why does it feel like it feels? And
Yeah.
so, having grown up in the information processing theory, there are simply things about the representational view that I don't think work. Um, Going all the way back to Locke's critique of correspondence theories of experience. So I was intrigued by the ecological psychologists and their notion of perception as a relational property. And then as I dug down deeper into that, I was eventually forced to ask, is there anything that's not relational? And if you ask that question, you actually end up back in 18th, 19th, early 20th century philosophies coming out of Germany and the continent. We call them idealism. That's kind of an unfortunate name, but these were people who refused to define reality in opposition to experience. So the traditional representational view is that I have something in me, a mind or a soul or a brain or a computer or whatever, it's in me. And I know what's outside of me because of the representations, images or whatever, that it causes within me. And of course, Hume made clear a long time ago that's logically incoherent, right? If all I know is what's inside of me, that's all I can ever know. So I can't step outside of that to get a God's eye view. So I just believe that as a lot of psychologists have. So as I tried to make my way into this notion of relationality and discovered people like Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, a lot of indigenous ontology, I had to find a way to talk about being that didn't necessitate something else happen so that consciousness could be there. So in the end, I'm going to argue that meaning, or what I will call embodied aboutness, is what we are. And once I talk about organisms as embodiments of context, I can talk about that embodied context as naturally and necessarily about the context that it embodies. Then I don't need the concepts physical or mental anymore. And for me, the last concept I had to get rid of was information, right? Because the concept of information is that meaning bit that sort of connects the outside to the inside. And I believe that when you're in that sort of ontology, it's still possible for consciousness to be epiphenomenal. So for me, just in order for it not to be epiphenomenal, I had to make it what we are. And that's the point of wild systems, is try to do that.
Awesome. Well, no, that's a great description of it. And that's kind of intuitive feeling too, because whenever, like you were saying, to extract the relational value out, whenever it seems as if everything is context dependent, you couldn't really imagine mass and dimensions existing without something to exist within, I presume.
Yep.
And so when I think about consciousness, if this model wild systems is, I guess it would propose that as these systems interact over time and become more complex biologically, consciousness is an inherent factor of that. That's a necessary driving factor of that self-organization that's occurring over time.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the trick is, for me, the maneuver, the philosophical maneuver is to take the thinking that everyone's doing in complex systems right now, and then ask yourself, how do we talk about complex systems while avoiding use of concepts like objective, subjective, physical and mental, mind and matter? And so that's where the idea of self-sustaining embodiments of context came from. So if you ask me to label what exists outside of my skin, I would call it an energy transformation hierarchy or an energy transformation system, which is completely consistent with all of science. There's nothing incompatible with science there. It's just when I start with that is my description of what's out here. Then when I ask myself what's in here, I can say, I am a self-sustaining hierarchical energy transformation embodiment of the energy transformation context I emerge and sustain myself within. And then epistemology is not gone, but it's different, because I don't need to use codes, representations, or signs to become about what I'm in. I'm already naturally and necessarily about what I'm in. So instead of talking about it as information transfer, I like to talk about it as modulating of context. So I need to be able to modulate the context within which I sustain myself. And of course, the context therefore modulates me, therefore modulating what I'm about. And those spaces, there an epistemic gap? There's no organisms that aren't about. And to be honest, there's nothing that's not about. So that was the point of the work. And believe me, coming up with the concept, embodiments of context, took about 15, 20 years. There was a point where I was still in systems theory and I was talking about them as self-organizing information pockets, right? And it was at that point that it still wasn't working. And I kind of recognized it was the concept of information that had to go.
I understand. Yeah. And that relation that I think you had made in one of your videos I'd watched that I find intriguing, and something that seems intuitive to me too, is the idea of the Higgs field permeating mass to be, like, instead of being this concept of the Higgs field existing and mass being the context by which mass is purveyed to particles. That's a kind of interesting phenomenon.
Well, it was one of the fun parts about wild systems, right? So on the one hand, we're stuck now trying to prove that anything's about its context, right? We're stuck with the grounding problem. And the reason we're stuck there is because for the past 100 years, we've been deconstructing the notion of relational properties. And the reason Bertrand Russell wrote a very influential paper in 1911 in which he wanted to take cultural authority away from the German idealists. I hate that word idealist, but that's what they're called. I like to call them coherence theorists, right? But Bertrand Russell, in a sense, wanted mathematics and logic to be this sort of cultural authority on what is reality. And to do that, he had to dismantle the idealist notion that reality is infinite, and that all subjects and objects are internally related, meaning that part of what it is to be a subject is its relation with an object, and part of what it means to be an object is its relation with the subject. So that what this does is make it metaphysically or ontologically impossible to say anything is independent. And
See.
so Bertrand Russell spent a lot of time in that argue, challenging the notion of internal relations. He felt he was successful by arguing that the relative height of Sam and Mary, that relation is independent of the two of them. And from my perspective, no, it's not, because Mary and Sam do not exist independently of each other. They exist in a similar context, even if it's on another planet. Everything going on that planet has an impact and shapes the context of this one. So there's nothing that exists in isolation from everything else. But the field dug the idea of mathematics and logic sort of dictating where we go with science and ontology. And so you get to the 60s and the 70s and everything's becoming externally related. And now we're stuck in a world of parts that are supposedly externally related. And then when you look at the philosophy of science the last 20 years, you have people challenging the intrinsicness of mass. So if it's an achievement in the writing on wild systems theory, is you look at the arguments going on by Bertrand Russell back at the turn of the last century.
Yeah.
And you see a century-long deconstruction of inherent relatedness to the point where everything becomes externally related. And then that goes so far that you then see certain philosophers of science attacking the notion of intrinsicness, which is bizarrely had to be deconstructed. And that's where the Higgs field stuff. Now, the people who proposed the Higgs field, that's how they had to make the math work. And they just basically said the Higgs field, what is it? Well, it's something that permeates all of reality.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we call infinite context, right? Yeah. So that was the moment. That was the big moment for wild systems, where I could connect the arguments of Bertrand Russell to make everything external, to contemporary philosophy of science, to trying to bring back the notion of internal relations, though they won't talk about it that way. Basically, they're arguing we are deconstructing the notion of intrinsic properties. And then if nothing's intrinsic, you're back to everything being relational, and in a place where I think we can be maximally coherent. So that discovery, which showed up for the first time in the Jordan and Day paper, was a good moment for wild systems theory.
That's really neat. And I really think something fundamental about the physics of the Higgs field and what they're finding out with the particle collider as far as subatomic particles is concerned is getting further and further in that direction. And inherently, you would assume that philosophy of science, or philosophy of mind, would have something to do with physics. Just if we are talking about an embodied context, you would assume we would have this relational aspect of the physical reality and intrinsic reality. And that's interesting. And I don't know how much you have looked into people who speak on panpsychism too much. Panpsychism, kind of, as I've studied it, I've kind of adopted my own idea of what I think it means. And it seems to convey this idea of a all-encompassing consciousness field in which all things exist.
Right.
And what I find intriguing about that is that most of the philosophers that promote this ideology assume that would require all things to be conscious. So like a rock would have, and so I was like, panpsychism makes sense that there could be this field of information that produces, what we feel as subjectivity and our external environment, and they're all interrelated. However, that wouldn't require that a rock or something like that be conscious, but it would exist within the conscious field of the observer almost.
Right. Panpsychism is definitely a route to take for those who are unsatisfied with notions of intrinsic properties, contemporary notions of representational theories of mind. And panpsychism is a route. The thing for me about panpsychism, right, is it's kind of like double aspect theory, in the sense that we have a conceptual framework. In the panpsychism framework, pan means everywhere, and psych means mind or psychology. In the double aspect theory, you've got the idea that everything has phenomenal and everything has physical properties. Yeah. And what I see going on in that is a carrying of our dualisms into a different place. And so for me, that's why I talk, it's a simple question. It's a bar question, right? Yeah. And that is bar, meaning you're at a bar. You can ask this question very simply. Do you believe that there's anything that exists as it does independently of all contexts? Nobody says yes. So if the answer is no, that means that everything can be coherently conceptualized as embodiments of context. Once I get there, once I've conceptualized reality as basically embodiment of context, or what I'll call soup and soup, then aboutness is easy. In representational frameworks, you have to have physical stuff that somehow carries aboutness from point A to point B. And all of that is a logically unnecessary way to talk about reality. Now, it is a way to talk about reality, but I would argue ultimately it's still a correspondence-driven framework, and it's incoherent because that logically contradicts itself. So if I talk about embodied context, then I can say, yeah, so a rock is an embodiment of its context. So yeah, it is about. And in one of the papers, we argue that the qualitative distinction between what we would call a rock or a non-living and a living system is the way that the micro macro properties of that system are coupled with each other. So for example, it's still energy, it's just energy in different ways. So when you look at a rock, you've got atoms holding together molecules, holding together a conglomeration of molecules, all within a gravity field, right? Now, the thing about that larger scale phenomenon, the macro phenomenon of the rock and the micro phenomena that constitute the macro phenomena, they aren't coupled in such a way that the two reorganize themselves to keep anything the same, right? What you've got going on in a rock is a competition between strong and weak forces, strong atomic forces, weak gravitational forces, and a rock is a compromise. So even a rock is a state of tension, right? A rock is, even though it looks stable, it's still a persistent state of tension between these forces. Now, when you look at self-organizing, self-sustaining energy transformers, like a single cell, the chemicals that constitute it, those chemicals are being kept together by the strong forces, much the same way as chemicals and atoms in a rock. But the thing is, those chemicals then are coupled with the cell as a whole in a way that the two perturb each other to reorganize around energy intake. Now, this isn't God's plan. This isn't some nothing came into reality to make this happen. What happened, according to Stuart Kaufman, is that certain systems emerged in the prebiotic soup that had a specific ratio of chemical reactions to chemical types that reached a critical threshold that gave rise to self-catalyzing chemical reactions. And so as that scales up, you just have this multi-scale system of work that rocks don't have. And that for me is the fundamental difference, but both systems are naturally and necessarily about. I would argue both systems are naturally and necessarily meaningful. There is nothing meaningless that exists. And these are concepts that were hard to get to where we are now, and very difficult to entertain by those who already have, strong opinions about what meaning is, and what aboutness is, and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. No, that's a really cool explanation. I like that. That fits in with the idea. And it provides, like you said, it gives meaning even more so than most other epistemological arguments for consciousness or anything. It doesn't do anything to degrade meaning or devolve to nihilism, kind of, sometimes Daniel Dennett will argue a lot for the illusory nature of consciousness, and that's a perspective. However, even if that were true, sometimes I feel as if it would be better to operate as if it weren't, and definitely not to be telling maybe young people and students that, hey, you're an illusion. I mean, just because of the devolvement to nihilism that is so inherent to that kind of thought. But like you talking about embodied context really puts into perspective that everything is so meaningful with your engagement with it. And so I really enjoy this take on consciousness, because we see a lot nowadays, at least I do, in the in vogue nature of things, that free will, consciousness are being reduced down to an illusion by a lot of prominent philosophers. And that was where I got into philosophy of mind by that attack angle. And I was starting to view it like that, thinking, oh, wow, this is interesting. And then I got to the point where when that became true to me, I was like, well, this takes away and extracts all value almost.
It's actually socially dangerous. And what's
Okay.
problem is that it's a category error. The information processing model worked extremely well in cognitive psychology as an epistemology, as a way to describing phenomena so we could generate experiments, check data. The problem with experimental psychology is that it believes that epistemology is ontology, right? And just because I can talk about my brain as a computer, it must be one. And that's a logically unnecessary way to think. And what I mean by logically unnecessary is there's no reason you have to necessarily think that way. I think we're still living in a century-long competition with religion, right? Trying to struggle for who has the final word in culture about what truth and reality are. And believe me, coming out of this post-COVID culture, it's very difficult for me to talk this way because people often think, well, you're anti-scientific. And it's like, no, as a matter of fact, I'm rather scientific. I use, like John Dewey, I use science as an epistemic tool, but it doesn't mean that the words I use in science have to be the words I use for reality. And I'm completely on board with your dissatisfaction for the devaluation of the human condition. And there's a level of smugness and arrogance that comes often with these statements. And the fact that they're based on an incoherent ontology is something I kind of get up for, well, let's go to a bar and work this out, because I can't tell my kid they're an illusion, and I can't tell people they're an illusion, even though it's just dangerous. It's also philosophically incoherent. So yeah, there's a bit of a militant vibe about WST, or world systems, going after these deflationary views. I mean, it wasn't just us. I mean, and I don't even know if it was Darwin. I mean, all Darwin said is that life evolves, right? And then out of what's here. And then everybody else said it's got to be physical. And it's still us fighting the church. And it's still us fighting supernaturality. And those are old fights. They're kind of done. It's the 21st century. Let's leave the tools of that struggle behind if we can. And I think physical and mental, objective, subjective, can be left behind. And there's all sorts of other political reasons I have for wanting to do that, but I'll stop.
No, I think that it's a noble endeavor within your to include that aspect of it as being one of the primary focal points of wild systems theory, is to eliminate that doctrine, or at least contest it, because like you said, the arrogant nature of the philosophers that do propagate that, generally they can't explain it very well. When they speak on the nature of conscious will, they say, well, when you hear a loud noise in your environment and you react to that stimuli with automaticity, well, that's not free will. And then they extrapolate that simple concept of responding to environmental stimuli on, to actually making complex logical maneuvers in life. And so, and they build from that premise, and that premise never seems to be challenged. And it's very nature that, of course, we react quickly and survivalistically to danger, but we certainly can contemplate and persevere and change the routing of our intent.
No, you're absolutely right. Let's just look at a court setting in the United States, murder trial, whatever. What's going to happen in a murder trial is the prosecution is going to bring every level of scale of detailed evidence he or she can bring to try to prove that defendant pre-specified the victim should die. Well, what's the defense going to do? It's going to use every single scale of efficacy it can. In other words, there's a brain problem. There's a past life problem. There's a sociological problem. All of these multiple scales of context are argued every day in our court system. Yet they're not argued every day as being what we are in experimental psychology, right? They're in philosophy of mind. In philosophy of mind, we use two concepts, physical and mental, or biological and chemical. And the cultural toolbox is just a little more robust than we use. And when I want to really get a representation of the human condition, I often end up going to the arts and the humanities instead of science. So I don't know what my favorite movie of all time, I just wrote a little bit about it, is Hayao Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke. And I won't go into great detail, but in that movie, you get to experience every character as an embodiment of their context, playing out their existence in a world full of other embodiments of context. And the traditional sort of extra moral viewpoint that shows up in Western cinema just doesn't show up there. No one's asking to be told they're good, bad, right, or wrong. They're living and they're sort of moving beyond these binaries. So I do see, oh my God, and a lot of American pop culture is really pushing us in these ways artistically. So I'm pretty psyched.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hear a lot, at least in the idea of philosophy of mind as it pertains to this, the fractal nature of reality as everything being made up patternistically of smaller parts of a larger whole. And I find that uniquely aligning with wild systems in a kind of way that demonstrates that you wouldn't necessarily need that moral landscape like you're saying. It would be an aspect of the context by which you exist. The self-organizing processes that lead to life inevitably depend upon right and wrong, but those are built into this self-organization, I would assume.
You have said it very well. I think I think the concepts of morality more and more, at least politically, have been overtaken by identity work. So someone looks at something and calls it wrong, or someone looks at something and calls it right.
Yeah.
I have to ask myself, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
And when I push through, there's this sort of correspondence moral of morality, just like we had correspondence models of experience where there's a real world out there and I generate representations of it and the two correspond. Yeah. When you hear a lot of contemporary morality, you hear about you did the wrong thing, you did the right thing. And the kind of assumption is that there is this Kantian a priori system of morals out there that our behavior corresponds to. And I think that this way of conceptualizing morality, particularly in the world of politics, is extremely stifling, because the world is inherently just as complex as the arguments made in a courtroom. And why shouldn't our Congress be arguing like a courtroom instead of arguing about right and wrong? And I mean, I'm reading this very good book right now. I think it's called The Dawn of Everything, The Beginning of Everything, where the authors, a couple of anthropologists, are showing that that Western notions of the Enlightenment, of individualism, of individual rights and such, are actually ideas that I want to use the word settlers, but the missionaries and such were bringing back from North America, from the indigenous populations here. So, for example, in the indigenous populations, if there was what we call a murderer, you didn't kill the person who did the killing. You made the other person's entire family pay restitution to the dead person's family.
I see.
Right? So it wasn't, you didn't just kill someone, you damaged their extended context. So therefore you have to repair that extended context. There was no system of court in the sense that one person, or there was no system of hierarchy in a sense one could tell another what to do. There were systems of hierarchy in terms of being able to problem solve quickly. So when the indigenous Americans went to Europe and saw kings and princes and all these things where people were telling other people what to do, they saw that as incredibly primitive, right? So we're seeing this coming full circle of what I'll holism, right? Where the world coming to recognize everything's about everything, nothing's about itself. And then you get to ask yourself, why would anybody say different if we kind of intuitively know this? And I'll just say that for the last 40 years, American politicians have been arguing a lot about what's right and wrong from both parties. But what is really happening is that both of them are getting wealthier, right? So in the name of these binary moral codes, the wealth of this country has been sucked up in such a small percentage of the population. It's ridiculous. Most people don't even know that it's going on because we're all too busy arguing about what's right and wrong. So they're not just dangerous in the classroom. It's a dangerous way to organize a group of people.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, I think the same thing sometimes as well, because like I think you're a binary bit comparison, comparing it to a 1 or a 0. You know, those aren't static, or those aren't dynamic. One, if it's a transistor is in a state of 1, it's in a state of 1. If it's in a state of 0, it's in a state of 0, and you can't make one or the other. I mean, it has to be physically turned off. And so you're inevitably stifled at this conversation in Congress or in any governing body if they start debating good and evil, because a 1 is a 1 and a 0 is a 0, and neither are going to become each other, you know. Like maybe mapping that onto a larger landscape that's dynamic and also circumstantial and context dependent, like Wild Systems kind of proposes, then you evolve humans' consciousness essentially, because then you're allowing crime and punishment to be viewed not eye for an eye, but what exactly is the reason for crime and punishment, and how do we address punishment as a whole? Pretty interesting.
And when we take someone we say has committed a crime and we put them in prison, and we can convince ourselves they're in prison because they were wrong, what we're doing is creating a cognitive barrier that allows us to not experience the suffering our decisions are rendering on their lives. In other words, by telling someone they're wrong, yes, they deserve to be in jail. I don't have to think about them. But if it turns out that I think about it in terms of, no, I really don't want those type of people running around in the world, therefore I'm going to take responsibility for saying I want them to suffer being excluded, that's a little more adult, a little more nuanced, and quite a bit more morally honest. So taking responsibility for how you want the world to be, instead of reducing it to binaries and blaming it on some Kantian category that we get to argue about forever, keeps us feeling happy, and it allows people to continue to get wealthier. So it's not just a philosophical argument. It's definitely a way of being. Certainly it is. And it's potential to evolve up the ladder from philosophy of mind to philosophy of being, like you just said, and then it affecting dramatically the way interactions between humans occur can lead to extremely, you know, landscape shifting changes, I would assume. Totally.
Good changes. And something intriguing that you had mentioned kind of about when we were talking about when do things become living and non-living, that was kind of the crux of my initial inquiry, was the fascination with inorganic, organic matter, and when and which point did consciousness emerge? I mean, if you have a line graph or something that splits off into living and non-living, where at what point does the split kind of occur? And I found that kind of a hard thing to figure out. Well,
maybe one of the issues is we're trying to use another binary, right? Because if you look, there are self-replicating crystal systems, right? And so there's something about autocatalysis is there, but it's not the same thing. So there are gradations of transformational styles between what we would call a rock and what we would call a living system. And we just haven't been looking at it that way. I think if we find, for example, and I'm sure the data are out there and I just don't know. Let's take a tornado, for example, okay? What if we find that the dynamics of a tornado are such that it keeps itself, its organizational dynamics actually serve to keep it at the point of maximum temperature differential between the two fronts? I would have to say that's a self-sustaining system. It's not just self-organized, but its dynamics are actually giving rise to the intake of the difference that fuels it, right? And so, that's open work. And I'm just excited that anyone would think, thinking of it as an embodiment of context would be a useful way to approach the issue.
Well, it really helps bridge the gap between a lot, because if you look into it, especially me coming from a non-academic standpoint, and you're just an interested reader of consciousness studies, it's hard to merge physicalist views with idealism, and then you start looking into that, and there's multiple sub schools of physicalism, and then there's multiple sub schools, and then you get almost, especially not being an academic person, you're really kind of lost, but you want to know about it. And so I got to the point kind of with the whole idea of, well, everything is a system, and everything is a smaller part of a larger whole. Within, when I think of a vehicle, I think of a cooling system, a brake system, an air conditioning system, but all of those existing independently can't make a car. But when we see a car, we're seeing the embodiment of all of those systems, allowing us to use the car to then traverse point A to B, which is kind of cool.
And if you want to know what driving is, you don't put your hand on top of the hood to feel the heat, because the driving doesn't exist in the engine. That's like putting a PET scan on a brain to find which parts are most active and saying that's where consciousness is. Consciousness is like flying. You wouldn't say that flying exists in a bird's wing, right? You wouldn't say that driving exists in a car's engine. It's a multi-scale phenomenon, and all of which that exists in multiple scales. And when you start thinking that way, what you start doing is experiencing your language is what I'll just call cognitive bubbles, right? They're just these bubbles we use to try to manage where we are, particularly when we're not trying to be abstract, when we're just walking with friends. Then, our arms and our feet and our leg, they're all making these moves through space, right? And I argue that's what words are. Words are a way of moving through abstract space. The curse of the brain is that it is inherently a self-sustaining system. And because it is, its work necessarily creates a border. So for example, every time you use a word, every time you look at someone, think of something, memories of how these things have played out are flooding into your cortex the whole time, creating a border between what should happen, right, and what does happen. And the should comes from the past, but you don't even feel yourself pushing this should into the world. It's just the way the brain's organized. It's that memory-driven border that allows us to be someone. For example, people diagnosed with schizophrenics, they can tickle themselves. Now we can't. Why? Well, when I go to do this, what happens is the planning areas, that the aspects of the brain involved in planning actually activate memories that constrain the sensory systems associated with my arms so that the activity is dampened. In other words, my memories end up changing the brain so I can experience an other. Oh, that's not me, that's that. And this fundamental othering that brains do, and all self-sustainings do, single cells create a border, right? You have to create a border to be a system. And by doing so, then you necessarily create otherness. And this otherness actually is what Merleau-Ponty called primordial perception. In other words, we tend to look at, for example, right now, I'm sitting here, I'm Scott, I'm talking, I got a computer in front of me. I have this foundational aspect of my phenomenology that has a self and an other. And it's precognitive. I label it self and other, but it's precognitive. What we tend to do, though, is take that fundamental othering as a given and then talk about me as a subjective entity and the world as an objective, and act like those two have to be related, as if there was no fundamental foundational othering that occurred in the first place. And it was drawing our attention to this foundational othering that got Kant started, got Schelling, it got Hegel, Heidegger. All of these field holist thinkers were sort of attacking this notion that there's a foundational separation, an epistemic gap, trying to look at, no, in fact, the othering comes from being. And that's just and again, that's something I just finally wrote that way the other day, to be honest. And it explains why we believed in an epistemic gap for centuries, right? Because we take phenomenology as given and then parse it into self and other, and then build a whole bunch of representations about how those two might be connected, when in fact they can't be, because they emerge out of being. So I'll shut up there.
No, that's really, really intriguing to me. first of all, when you have mentioned at the beginning of that kind of, I guess they talk in philosophy sometimes what they call the is-ought problem. In the world that is a way that says it ought to be some other way. Well, this wild systems idea implies that, once again, that is inherently wrapped into the context of the being aspect of it. So this is a problem doesn't exist because simply the separation of self and other that's become so stoic and like a wall that we have to tear down, in self and other. And if we're looking at it like that, but if you can look at it like you're proposing with wild systems, it seems to me like the is-ought problem that has been debated so hotly for so long, it goes away because it is as it ought to be because it is.
Yes, and then we get to, well, what could the thing that we call our consciousness ever do? Now, when I use the word conscious here, I'm talking about me suddenly being aware of the things I'm doing. And the Bernie Barr's global workspace theory makes it pretty clear. When I'm surprised, what happens is that most of the things that are usually going on unconsciously on autopilot, memory driven, such as walking, talking. Right now, if I had to think about all of these movements, I wouldn't be able to say a word. I wouldn't even say a word a minute. All of this is being formed by memory. It comes out of me as memory, and I don't feel myself generating it. But what does happen is I'm walking down the stairs talking to a friend, and suddenly I start to fall. Now my awareness moves from that conversation and his incoherent argument to the fact that I'm about to hit the ground. Then the entire brain dumps itself into that one level of control. It dumps itself into kicking my foot out so I don't fall. So consciousness almost is really there to detect problems, right? Make the whole brain available to solve one particular level of work at a moment, which means most of the time we are functioning on autopilot, but it's not like a blind computer. Every bit of work that we do is necessarily border creating, border sustaining, right? Yeah. So reaching out to grab an apple is not a stimulus response phenomenon. It's a multi-scale system of work that sustains itself when I finally get the apple, do the work of biting it, and all that energy then replenishes the climbing systems, the eating systems and stuff. So yeah, a lot of these problems emerged out of taking Descartes seriously, and then taking Locke seriously, and then taking, realism seriously, and the subjective objective divide seriously, and then building massive amounts of words and logical structures around those things. Those just don't become necessary. And we see ourselves as embodiments of everything that create our own borders because we can't be without them. And
exactly. No, that's interesting too. Like you were mentioning with birds, when you talk about birds flying, you don't assume that that's an integral part of the wing. You assume that's part of the form of the bird. It seems kind of maybe Aristotelian to me. Like he would argue a lot of times about a table and what makes a table a table. Is it a table because it's used as a table, or what gives something its form? Is it inherent to its being and contextually dependent? And so Aristotle seemed to write sometimes, or Plato seemed to write on this idea of some people look at a cup and its singular use as a drinking object, or some people can look at a cup and could temporarily use it to scrape ice off their windshield or something like that.
Yes.
You could see the cup being two purposes at once because it's contextually dependent. Its meaning is contextually dependent upon what you're using it to do, similar to potentially our cognition.
Yeah, and yes. And an issue we have faced in the philosophy of mind is taking the cupness as a given, right? And then asking how that givenness relates to us. Look, that cup is a persistent state of tension. There's nothing stable about that cup for free, right? All those strong atomic forces have been shaped by us, perhaps, to put it in a particular, and all we've done is manipulate tension, right? And we've manipulated tension, and that tension now is stable in a relative sense to the type of stabilities we sustain. But there's no arrow between us. I would argue that we actually live in multiple time scales simultaneously. Instead of living in one window of time, one whatever that could mean,
Yeah.
My single cells have time scales, neural networks have time scales, organs have time scales, and we're just massive conglomerations. I like to call us self-sustaining tornadoes, right?
Yeah.
We got a whole lot of that tornado-y stuff going on in us. And it's just all able to do opponent processing enough, or opponent dynamic organization enough to stay what would be called stable. But that stable is always scale relative. There's nothing fixedly stable,
Yeah,
so.
especially when you're talking about having a nervous system, when you're talking about evolution of mammals, and you're talking about central nervous system evolving at that point, and now you've got these kind of cognitive re-representations, or these implicit maps of our body kind of in our brain, then you really invite this complex way of managing entropy, really, because now that we can take thoughts, feelings, homeostatic needs, and we have to find a way to get those ideas separate from just the drive to get them, if that makes any sense. And I think,
well, they pay for themselves, right? In other words, being to create and sustain abstract contexts. Like if you go downtown to wherever city you live in, or whatever town you live in, right? There are buildings, there's a road, there's signs. All of those are about all of us. The heights of the doors are about all of us, right? The doorknobs and the pressures they have to use to open, they're all about all of us. And I guess a school building would be a better example. A school building, what it does is take these lower scale energy tensions between, atoms and molecules, and form them in ways that end up affording multi-scale human interactions across massive time scales of 50 years, 100 years, depending on how long the school lasts. And then when you get the humans, all these humans having their own lived lives up to that point, intersecting with these phenomena like books that have massive amounts of abstract aboutness downloaded into them, cultures basically transforming our potentialities into ways that allow us to be cooperatively with each other. And in the end, that's what I would call culture. And for me, the advantage is there's a homological unity across energy transformation. It's all about generating stability and energy flux. And that just gives me a very coherent way of thinking about everything. So
absolutely. Yeah. And it gives meaning in the sense that what is unique, even within the model of wild systems, that preserves meaning outside of just us being an embodiment of context, to me at least, is the idea that we're anti-entropic in a certain kind of way, where DNA and biological organisms, I found it hard to justify kind of with any philosophy of how something would fight against entropy, so much so that it increased complexity to the point of central nervous systems, and thought, well, that's kind of hard to explain. Well, that makes sense with your model that you're proposing, kind of, is that this is explained by how neurons begat more neurons whenever they have an action potential. So it would assume that they're self-generating. So it's not necessarily anti-entropic, because technically maybe you could perceive of more neurons as actually being more entropic. Maybe that's more disorder potentially.
Well, now you've hit the nail on the head. And that's just this paper I just wrote. My favorite book ever is W.G. Sebald's The Rings of Saturn, in which he creates a narrative structure that allows the reader to experience themselves as an energy transformation system nested within the energy transformation dynamics of everything. And he does it by taking traditional literary genres like the travelogue, the biography, the novel, etc., and he bashes these genres against each other. You don't know how they work, and what this does is disrupt the stability that you have as you normally read, because your memories aren't working. So things get disrupted, and in the midst of that disruption, he says things, for like there's one scene where he has the narrator walk up a thing called Dunwich Heath, which allows him to look inland towards Britain and then out to the sea. Yeah. And as he makes this climb and he's looking, he suddenly starts discussing the memories since post the last ice age. This was all trees at one point, and slowly but surely they've been burned off to create more humans, right? And then he looks to the sea and he talks about the herring and how many herring does it take to create a human mansion, right? And he puts all of this in the energy transformation context of reality. And you as a reader get to feel yourself to be a part of that. And what you come to grips with then is that we are naturally and necessarily entropy systems. Our very being generates disorder, and the more complex we become, the more disorder we generate, to the point where, some could say we're close to deselecting ourselves as a species.
Yeah, that's quite intriguing, really. I've been thinking about this idea of anti-entropy, and that's a hard thing to justify. I think maybe the idea of the complexity, self-organization of biological life has led to epistemological reasoning being at the crux of explaining this, because people can't justify, well, if I manufacture a car, in 100 years, it's rusted, decrepit, and useless. But a human in 100 years can leave behind all of this stuff, even when they're dead, that actually makes the world better. But what we don't realize is the mechanism by which they're leaving that behind, the body, the mind, all of that is also decaying into nothing. And philosophy of science generally would indicate too that, at least I think so, that scientific knowledge that we think now is fact would inevitably become completely false in 100 years, if it were following the same patternistic trajectory of scientific discovery of the past, where you've seen like complete flips on things like tectonic plates and gravity and relativity. So really, we could be contributing even with knowledge to this disorder by putting out all these facts and then inevitably stifling progress by being so hell-bent on these facts.
No, that's fantastic. And that's the curse. We can't be without othering. We can't be abstract without creating representations. So therefore, we necessarily have to create maps, representations of reality through math, through poetry, whatever, if we're going to be in the abstract realm. And the cost of that is whatever costs might be incurred by that representational system. So when we unleashed, the power of the atom and started fueling things with nuclear power, we might think things like radiation is dangerous, but what we've not been doing is asking how is our very being. What we've not been doing is looking at ourselves as systems that naturally necessarily destroy, right? And because we don't do that, because we're still stuck in a fairly Christian duality, even though in the scientists, it's not Christian, it's information, right? My mind is information. If my mind's information, it can be eternal. The singularity is here and we'll all be saved, right? What you get to do when you think that way is ignore the entropy-driven nature of your being. You get to avoid the suffering in reality created by the fact that you're here. So, for example, on topics such as racism, I'll ask my students, how many of you are racist? And I'm not. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I love everyone. And I say, well, I actually believe that. The question isn't so much what's consciously going on. The question is what's staying the same in the world because of the way you live. So every time you go to the gas pump, right, you're sustaining one of the most massive entropy generating systems that has ever emerged, which is our reliance on, fossil fuels. Now, I'm just not a naysayer. It's like, dudes, that's how we busted stuff down to release the energy in it so we could become increasingly abstract. And as we become increasingly abstract, we can break stuff down to the point where now we're recognizing, hey, maybe the way we've been breaking stuff down is deselecting us. So maybe let's look at other ways to capture energy, hence solar, wind, etc. So I don't ever look at it as we did it wrong. A system either sustains itself or it doesn't. And human species perpetuates itself or it doesn't. The planet will still be here. So I just find it more effective. And I also find this way of thinking more efficient and effective when it comes to problem solving. Well, how are we going to think about this, try to manage things differently? Well, if you get stuck with kind of binary tools like right and wrong, we're not going to get very far.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And I think that, and I think even just not to clarify, I think that you're when you say, yeah, we're contributing overall to the massive entropy of the petroleum industry when we fill up our gas tank, it's not that you're proposing that we stop buying gas. It's just acknowledging that we are a participant in a larger entropy, disseminating culture, and
Yeah.
acknowledgement of that inevitably is something that can lead further to meaning and further to solution. But you're not saying humans are bad. You're just saying acknowledging that we do create entropy is integral to acknowledging our role in the disorder that we always want to criticize. Is that correct, kind of?
No, I think you're on target. Here's the thing: if everything's about everything and nothing's about itself, then life is not about finding meaning. Life is about managing meaning. It's about managing what you're about, because you're never not going to be about. So how do you manage what you're about? Acknowledging that you are part of everything then allows you to figure out how you're going to manage the suffering generated in the world because you're here.
Yeah.
And then we make our way into a form of Buddhism, right? The
Yeah.
joyful embracement of the sorrow that is life. And what looks like centuries old spiritualism actually turns out to be coherent philosophy in the 21st century. I think in the end, Wild Systems is, for me, the sort of bringing together all the things that itched, and then trying to make sense of it. And I will say that the philosopher who really did it for me was a guy named Michael Oakeshott. So he's often called a political philosopher, but actually what he did was in 1933 published a book, Experience and Its Modes, in which he brought the idealism of Hegel, Collinsworth into the early 20th century debate on meaning and reality, and made it just a straightforward anti-correspondence, totally pro-coherence take on reality and truth, and then said what that means for, if we believe in subjective objective divisions, then science will always have the final word on truth. Yeah. Because science is the system that supposedly transcends subjectivity to get to objectivity. Yeah. But if you don't believe in that, then you recognize that all statements of truth are about coherence, lack of contradiction. And then that's not a quick political argument, right? And you can't save souls with that way of thinking, and you can't tell people they're right. So, but Oakeshott was the one who kind of freed up my thinking and made it clear that, for example, science can never tell art if it's right or wrong or good. Science can never tell politics if it's right or wrong or good. That gives back to the is-ought thing, yep. Right? Science is a system of quantitative coherence, yeah. Trying to quantify the phenomena that we're embedded within and generate maximum quantitative coherence. That is not at all what constitutes truth in politics. It's not at all what constitutes truth in art. And so Oakeshott wanted to make sure that science wasn't dominating the cultural conversation on truth and reality, because he felt the conversation was stagnating. And I thought he was very coherent. And I was going to say right, but from a coherence perspective. So he's the guy that did it for me. And then I think, okay, this is the way I need to do this. And very, very inspired.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Yeah. And I think that what Wild Systems helped me do as well, just looking back through a lot of your videos and trying to understand it better, was really apply a definition to consciousness. I was struggling with this defining aspect of this word that seems now that it's become so misapplied or just, it can mean anything at this point, it seems like. And so I think Wild Systems for me grounded definitively the word consciousness. And with doing that, really at that point, you can actually make some headway, at least in your mind, on what consciousness is, because people are, I kept trying to define it in every different school of philosophy I stumbled upon. Some people, it was the recognition of self as separate from other. Some it was complex computation, similar to a computer or a process, right. And then others, it was an illusion. And I was like, well, what exactly does consciousness function and what does it serve? And that can lead you, if you're especially not being in academia, it can lead you on a wild goose chase with not the correct knowledge base. So I'm kind of going these different avenues. And wild systems, I came upon it, and you're in Vervaeke's discussion, and was like, oh, this kind of defines consciousness, explains meaning, does not dispose of free will, and also inherently acknowledges the entropy nature of our existence, kind of
Yep.
holistically establishing not just the definition of consciousness, but almost life too.
The way I checked off all the boxes, those are the ones I was trying to check off.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I found, that it really helped me put those pieces that were just kind of floating out there in my mind together.
And here's just another thing about wild systems, is that it's consistent with what it feels like to be alive. In other words, when I was growing up reading information process, I don't feel like a computer. I don't feel like an algorithm, but I do feel like an embodiment of context. And I do feel more, if you look at a fish and you look at a fish moving, no one has any problem understanding that the trajectory of that fish is not only constrained by the water that surrounds it, but the water that surrounds all that water. And the shores thousands of miles away and on the planet. No one has any problem with the notions that everything's about everything when we think about a fish. But when we think about ourselves in a medium that we don't experience, we're in air and we don't experience airness. The Gibsonians got it right. We experience walkability, jumpness, right? So the medium sort of feels transparent. It's easiest for us to just accept that foundational othering. That's a hill. I'm me. I've got to climb that hill. And that's how it really is. And that's where I'm going to start my entire description about is and ought, right? And I think the court of law doesn't function that way. And I don't live that way. And if living is managing aboutness, then every stage of life makes sense. Every stage of life is a struggle to be. I love Shakespeare, and he's right, to be or not to be, right? And if you're going to be, you got to be where you are. Even if you want to be somewhere else, you got to get there by being where you are. So there's no point in not working. And I think one of the reasons we got so led astray is because we're so seduced by this idea of eternal non-working, right? We called it heaven, and then we called it information, right? And it's these places of non-contingency, non-work, that are experienced, that are as being like a reward or being better. And that's just a pretty adolescent view of goodness, right? If you allow people to see themselves as embodiments of everything, that can live a life and be at the later stages of life, going through their pain, seen a lot of suffering, and coupled with a sense of endurance, coupled with a sense of long-term being, experience themselves as a story, as opposed to a physical thing that's about to die and is no good anymore, so it might as well go away anyway. There's no grace provided by physicalist frameworks, and that's just inconsistent with being. It's inconsistent with what it feels like to be alive. And if someone's going to tell me that my grief is less real than a rock, I just don't know how to be there in that conversation, because that's just logically incoherent. So wild systems isn't a religion, yet it is a way of being, much like Buddhism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a philosophy of being, or a method by which to, kind of extract meaning out of something that could be devolved to nihilism if you weren't careful. It's important that we align with something, and whether that be religion or something else, wild system preserves its foundation, meaning, and defines consciousness, and solves some of those problems. And I think something neat too, I know we've been about an hour, but I was going to say something that I find, something else that I found that I think aligns with your perspective, is the work that Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, they're anestheticists and a physicist, and their kind of analysis of what the microtubules in the neuron, what their role is when anesthesia is administered, and kind of viewing consciousness versus wakefulness and seeing the difference. I think that if that were to be observably proven, it would pay a lot of credence to wild systems, because what all that's doing is interrupting the last level of cognition, almost, where you're aware of the sensory nature. It's not necessarily removing consciousness, but it's taking that third embodiment, or that inner working of all the systems that are in the body. It just removes the ability of one of those systems to operate. So I think it's not extracting consciousness by any means. Consciousness isn't this imaginary sense of energy that goes away. It's just interrupting one of the final stages of cognition of feeling, where you would associate the pain with self.
Yes. So it's sort of reorganizing the type of work being done.
Exactly. That's what I think. That's what I think.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. And then when you ask yourself, well, what is it that can disrupt the type of work I'm doing? And then you suddenly say everything, right? And then you recognize just how hard your damn neurons are working every second, how hard your muscles are working. I mean, we don't ever feel ourselves fighting gravity, right? Until we're drunk or we're really tired.
Yeah.
And then we feel ourselves fighting gravity, or when that sidewalk is that much higher than we thought and we trip on it, right?
Uh-huh.
But man, we're working hard all the time. And I think there's just a very generative way of thinking about what we are and what we do when we conceptualize ourselves as embodiments of work. Doesn't have to be a Protestant thing where somehow we're going to get a great eternal prize at the end.
Yeah.
It's just the beautifully ugly nature of existing in this muck and struggling to make beautiful things happen. And there's a certain grace that comes with that it's hard to get in life if you don't come to experience yourself that way. And then you get to be older and you despair because you won't be eternal, as opposed to seeing eternity, something in terms of what have others embodied that you respect because you've been here.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? What have other people embodied that you respect because you've been here? And once you recognize that, you do care what other people respect about you, then carry yourself in such a way to maximize what you think about what you did today, 10 years from now. And carry yourself with the goal of developing memories of self-respect. And once we do that, we're just going to become more other regarding. That's just all there is to it, because when other people suffer and we look at them, we suffer. Yeah. So the easiest thing to do is just turn away, and we don't experience that suffering. But when we do find ourselves walking into it, there's a way to be in that space that leads to pride. I was there, when that crap was happening, I was there and I was trying to help. And, our rhetoric forces people to say things like, oh, I didn't make the right choice. I should have made a different choice. And I'm so sick and tired of hearing these kind of ways of describing we all be what we can be where we are. And if we want to remember it with respect, then think about that now instead of then.
That's an excellent way of saying it, and it encapsulates how we can view eternity and still maintain a positive outlook on life and being at the same time, without said de-evolution, the arrogance, pride, and then unforgiveness that a lot of times dominates older people who have definitely misaligned. And that's an intriguing concept. And I think like things like beauty, platonic values, things like that are kind of hard to describe because they're abstract. Those lead a lot of people to the philosophical inquiries, like, well, what defines that beauty, and what draws somebody towards a rose and away from something that would be, not beauty. And the thing is that's, like you said, that it's biological, probably, and intuitively within our evolution, that we would be drawn to things that aren't poisonous, aren't toxic, aren't going to lead to our death. Just biologically, our lower level intelligence is going to orient us towards what's kind of been ingrained. And then additional to that, we can use cognition and memory to reason our way through what's beautiful based on how it contributes to our life, I suppose.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, that was really fascinating to go over that with you. I don't want to keep you too much longer. It's been a little bit over an hour.
No, that's perfectly fine. I very much appreciate you reaching out, and enjoy the conversation, and be your best wild system.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'll continue to follow your work and follow your channel. And hopefully we talk again in the future. But thanks again for joining me and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You. Bye.